The engineers were helpless, sweating as the multi-million-dollar flight simulator crashed with a top student trapped inside. When the quiet woman from the cafeteria approached, they laughed at her. The head engineer told her to step back, to leave the real work to the professionals. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice. She simply stepped past him to a locked terminal and spoke a single line of code from memory, a code that wasn't supposed to exist. In an instant, the alarms went silent, the hydraulics stopped shaking, and every screen turned green. But it was the look on the Academy commander's face that silenced the entire room. He stared at the cafeteria lady not with confusion, but with pure terror, because he knew exactly who she was, and that the ghost he had buried 15 years ago had just come back to end his career. Welcome to Untold Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of silence, sacrifice, and a long overdue reckoning, tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe that true honor can never be erased, hit that subscribe button and help us share the stories that matter. The National Air Force Academy, gleaming under the western desert sun, was a world built on order and ambition. Its polished corridors smelled of jet fuel and the palpable sense of expectation that filled every corner. This was where the nation's best were forged into masters of the sky. At the heart of this world was the cafeteria, a loud, bustling hall that came to life at the same time every day. The laughter of young lieutenants, the pilot candidates who would one day command entire fleets, mingled with the metallic clatter of trays and the audacious dreams they shared about their futures. Within this vibrant tableau moved a woman who was like a phantom. Her name was Elena, but the number of people who knew it could be counted on one hand. She was simply the woman from the cafeteria. In her mid-50s, with streaks of gray in her hair and deep lines etched into her face, she looked as if the relentless energy of these ambitious youths had worn her down. Her shoulders were perpetually stooped, bowed under an invisible weight of years. She arrived at the same hour every day, wore the same faded gray work uniform, and meticulously avoided eye contact with anyone. Her job was not to speak, but to clean. She wiped down tables, collected empty trays, and cleaned up spills. Her presence was as noticeable as a stain on the floor and just as quickly forgotten once she had erased it. The young pilots walked past her without even sensing her existence. She was a muted detail in their brilliant world, an unseen cog in the functioning machine. But a careful observer might have noticed the peculiarities behind the ordinary facade. Elena's hands were more than just a cleaner's hands. Though worn by years of contact with cleaning chemicals, her movements possessed a flawless economy. She never made a superfluous gesture when collecting trays, and she loaded the dishwasher with the same methodical precision a soldier might use to field strip a rifle. Sometimes, when the roar of an F-35 tearing through the sky from the training runway reached her through the cafeteria's large windows, she would freeze for a moment. The rag in her hand would stop, her eyes would drift to the distance, toward the source of the sound, and an indescribable expression would cross her face. A shadow of longing, of pain, perhaps of a forgotten pride. Then, just as quickly, she would come back to herself and return to her work, as if nothing had happened. The young pilots walked past her without even sensing her existence. She was a muted detail in their brilliant world, an unseen cog in the functioning machine. But a careful observer might have noticed the peculiarities behind the ordinary facade. Elena's hands were more than just a cleaner's hands. Though worn by years of contact with cleaning chemicals, her movements possessed a flawless economy. She never made a superfluous gesture when collecting trays, and she loaded the dishwasher with the same methodical precision a soldier might use to field strip a rifle. Sometimes, when the roar of an F-35 tearing through the sky from the training runway reached her through the cafeteria's large windows, she would freeze for a moment. The rag in her hand would stop, her eyes would drift to the distance, toward the source of the sound, and an indescribable expression would cross her face. A shadow of longing, of pain, perhaps of a forgotten pride. Then, just as quickly, she would come back to herself and return to her work. Colonel Marcus Wallace, the Academy's commander, was the man at the pinnacle of this orderly world. With his sharp gaze, impeccable uniform, and an always controlled demeanor, he was the living embodiment of everything the Academy represented. Yet he too had a secret no one knew. Sometimes, while gazing out his office window, his eyes would fix on the quiet woman leaving the cafeteria. His face would harden, his jaw would clench, and he would unconsciously tighten his grip on the pen in his hand. In those moments, Colonel Wallace was not a commander, but a man living with the heavy burden of guilt. He and this woman shared a past that no one knew, a past sealed with blood and fire. That day was not an ordinary one for the Academy. The Air Force's highest-ranking generals and a delegation from the Department of Defense had arrived for the official unveiling of the Academy's new pride and joy, the Stormbird flight simulator. This multi-million-dollar marvel of technology was not just a training tool, it was a symbol of the Academy's and Colonel Wallace's prestige. The simulator could replicate with absolute realism even the most extreme conditions a pilot might face in their career, from an engine failure in the eye of a typhoon to electronic jamming in enemy airspace. The observation room, located inside the massive hangar that housed the simulator, was wrapped in a tense silence. Colonel Wallace watched from behind the glass as Lieutenant Harris sat in the simulator's cockpit. Harris was the Academy's brightest, most talented, and perhaps most arrogant pilot candidate. This demonstration flight could be a launching pad for his career. "Initiate the scenario," Wallace said, his voice attempting a confidence that couldn't quite hide the tension beneath. The head engineer, a self-assured man in his 30s named David Chen, entered a series of commands. The screens inside the simulator came to life, and Lieutenant Harris found himself in the midst of an approaching superstorm over the Pacific Ocean. Rain hammered against the cockpit's canopy, and the howl of the wind filled his headset. "Everything is nominal. The Stormbird is performing perfectly," Chen said, turning to the generals. But just then, a shrill, ear-splitting alarm blared from within the simulator. The data on the screens began to flicker nonsensically, and the hydraulic systems shook with a violent groan. The look of self-assurance on Lieutenant Harris's face was replaced by panic. "I'm losing control! The system isn't responding to my commands!" The relaxed atmosphere in the observation room instantly froze. Engineers rushed to the consoles in a panic. "Total failure in the hydraulic pressure, but the sensors read normal. That's impossible," shouted a young technician. David Chen, wiping sweat from his brow, typed frantically on his keyboard. "I'm trying to reboot the system, but it's locked. We're getting a feedback loop error from the main core. The doors are locked too. We can't get them out." Panic spread through the room like a virus. Colonel Wallace's face was ashen. This was not just a technical malfunction. This was a catastrophe unfolding before the eyes of the country's top commanders. A trapped pilot inside, a multi-million-dollar machine out of control, and his, Colonel Wallace's, career about to be torn to shreds. At that same moment in the cafeteria, Elena was preparing for the day's final service. The monotonous hum of the dishwasher usually drowned out the outside world. But that shrill alarm, that sound was a memory that could penetrate the thickest walls. As the sound washed over the cafeteria in waves from the hangar, Elena dropped the metal tray she was holding. It crashed to the floor with a loud clang that no one noticed. Elena's eyes were fixed on empty space. That sound. It was the last sound she had heard 15 years ago in the cockpit of a prototype jet, spinning in flames over the Nevada desert. It was the sound of twisting metal, the herald of failure and death. She didn't hesitate for a second. A door in her mind, locked for 15 years, was kicked open by that alarm. She wiped her wet hands on her apron and began to walk toward the hangar with a speed and determination that no one would have expected from her. On her way, she didn't even notice the bewildered cook who stared at her or the janitor who tried to block her path. There was only one thing in her mind, that sound, and the instinct to answer it. When she reached the massive doors of the hangar housing the simulator, the chaos inside was palpable even from the outside. 2 security guards were trying to keep curious personnel away. One of them stepped in front of Elena. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. Please turn back." Elena didn't even look at his face. Her eyes were locked on the simulator room inside the hangar, a halo of frantic activity surrounding it. She walked past him as if he wasn't there. The guard, momentarily stunned by her unexpected strength and resolve, didn't know how to react. When Elena reached the glass door of the observation room, the scene inside was one of complete fiasco. Engineers were yelling at each other, generals were watching with grave concern, and Colonel Wallace stood like a petrified statue. She heard the head engineer, Chen, shout, "We can't break the feedback loop manually. The software has locked itself down." It was in that moment that the Phoenix, dormant for 15 years, was reborn. When Elena opened the door and stepped inside, all conversations were cut short as if by a knife. Everyone turned to this unexpected visitor in a dirty gray uniform. David Chen turned to her, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. "Who are you? For God's sake, get out of here, immediately! What are you doing here?" Elena ignored his insult and the astonished glares. Her eyes were locked on the cascading lines of code on the main console screen. She knew that code. She saw it in her nightmares. She walked slowly toward the console. "Stop sending the reset command," she said. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but it carried an authority that left no room for doubt. "You're triggering the system's quantum lock. With every attempt, you're burying it deeper." The engineers looked at each other. The quantum lock was the system's deepest and most theoretical defense layer. No one had thought it could actually be activated in practice. Chen, his voice wavering between sarcasm and desperation, said, "And what do you suggest we do, ma'am? Take a coffee break?" Elena didn't even turn to him. Her eyes were still on the screen. "There's a manual override protocol. At the hardware level, you need to access it." Chen laughed, a harsh, nervous sound. "A manual override? This machine runs on the most advanced AI in existence. There is no such back door." "Yes, there is," Elena said calmly, "because I was the one who had them put it there." Then she gave the command that made everyone's blood run cold. "Open the terminal. On the command line, type code 88-Delta-Tango-Phoenix and press enter." An absolute silence reigned in the room. Phoenix. The word hung in the air. Upon hearing it, Colonel Wallace flinched visibly. His face was as pale as a corpse's. Chen stared at the woman as if she were insane. That's not a code, it's a nonsensical string of words." "Just type it!" Elena roared. Her voice suddenly filled the entire room, a force that seemed to vibrate the very glass. This was not the voice of a cafeteria worker. This was the voice of a commander, accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. A young technician, without waiting for Chen's approval, typed the code with trembling fingers. Everyone held their breath. The moment he pressed the enter key, a miracle occurred. All the red lights went out simultaneously. The shrill alarm fell silent. The terrifying shudder from the simulator's hydraulics ceased with a soft hiss. The main screen went dark for a second, then came back to life with a bright green light. In large letters, a single sentence was written: Phoenix Protocol engaged. Manual control active. System stable. Lieutenant Harris's relieved sigh could be heard over the speakers from the cockpit. Control, I have control. The system is back to normal. No one in the observation room was speaking. Everyone was staring at this ordinary woman in the middle of the room, calmly wiping her hands on her apron. Who was she? How could she possess this impossible knowledge? The door opened and Colonel Wallace stepped inside. But there was no longer panic in his eyes. On his face was the pained resignation of a man forced to confront a fate he had been running from for years. When his eyes met Elena's, everyone in the room felt the invisible electric current that passed between them. Wallace's lips parted, and he repeated that call sign in a whisper. Phoenix? It wasn't a question, but a recognition, the confirmation of the resurrection of a forgotten legend, of a ghost. The most senior of the generals, unable to hide his astonishment, turned to Wallace. Colonel, what is going on here? Who is this woman, and what in God's name is this Phoenix Protocol? Wallace swallowed. The lump in his throat was the weight of a 15-year-old lie. Without taking his eyes off Elena for a second, he took a deep breath. He had nowhere left to run. The time had come to tell the truth. Gentlemen, he said, his voice trembling but clear, I need to tell you about the X-22 prototype fighter jet crash that happened 15 years ago. Most of you will remember it. The official report states that the crash was caused by pilot error, resulting from the test pilot pushing the aircraft's limits too far. He paused, scanning every face in the room. That report specifies that the pilot's license was revoked, all her medals of honor were stripped, and she was quietly and dishonorably discharged from the Air Force. Wallace took a step toward Elena. As the distance between them narrowed, the tension in the room grew. I am here now to tell you that that report was a lie from start to finish. The pilot in the cockpit that day was Captain Elena Phoenix Rostova, and she was a hero. The whispers in the room died instantly. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the rest of the confession. That day, Wallace continued, tears now streaming down his face, I was the X-22's co-pilot, the flight engineer. I was the one who did the pre-flight fuel-to-weight and engine torque calibrations. I rushed the numbers. I miscalculated a critical value, off by a mere 2%. When the aircraft lost stability in the air, right after breaking the sound barrier, it was my fault. Because of my damn mistake, that plane started to fall out of the sky like a coffin. Wallace's voice was choked with remorse. We had lost all control. I was in a panic, but she, Elena, was calm. She did the impossible. She managed to guide the falling aircraft, a dead piece of metal, and glide it to an empty patch of land miles away from the nearest town. She saved both our lives. But my career was over in that moment. A court-martial, prison. I was going to lose everything. But she, Wallace said, his voice dropping to a whisper, she wouldn't allow it. In her hospital bed, covered in bandages, she asked one thing of me, that I write the report and put all the blame on her. She said I had a bright future, that my life shouldn't be ruined because of one mistake. I resisted, I refused, but she made me swear. She made me swear to take this secret to my grave. She sacrificed everything, her career, her honor, her life, to pay for my mistake. and I rose through the ranks in the shadow of her sacrifice. I built a career on her ashes." The confession fell like an atomic bomb in the middle of the room. The cafeteria lady, ignored for years, her name unknown, was in fact a living legend, a hero. And the Academy's respected commander was the man who had stolen her honor. Throughout all this, Elena had not said a single word. There was no anger, no vengeance, no look of triumph on her face. There was only a sense of relief, a weary peace that came from the crushing weight she had carried on her shoulders for 15 years finally being lifted. The senior general looked first at Wallace with disgust, then at Elena with deep admiration and respect. He walked forward with a flawless military stride and came to a sharp halt in front of her, delivering a crisp salute. Every other ranking officer in the room followed his lead without a moment's hesitation. In that instant, the observation room transformed into a shrine where a hero's honor was being restored. "Captain Rostova," the general said, his voice loud and clear, "on behalf of the Air Force, I apologize to you for your service and your honor to this country. This terrible mistake will be rectified immediately." After that day, nothing at the Academy was ever the same again. Colonel Marcus Wallace accepted his court-martial and the stripping of his rank as a matter of honor. As for Elena, her former rank of captain, all her medals of honor, and her full rights were restored, and then some. She was offered a top-tier instructor position to train the next generation of pilots at the Academy. Elena refused the cameras, the ceremonies, and the spotlight. She only wanted a piece of her quiet life back, the sky. She accepted the offer on one condition. She would take charge of the Stormbird Simulator Center and its testing program. That way, she could ensure that no young pilot's life would ever be endangered again because of someone else's mistake or a faulty line of code. No one called her the woman from the cafeteria anymore. She was Captain Elena Phoenix Rostova. When young pilots passed her in the hallway, they would stop and salute. But it wasn't just a routine salute given to a superior officer. It was a gesture of profound respect for a living legend who had shown them the true meaning of sacrifice, honor, and quiet strength. And Elena would accept each salute with a faint, weary smile before returning to the place she belonged, the quiet world of machines and the dreams of the sky.